Story is really it's the very basis of our human experience. What I mean by that is you think about the human experience, what sets apart humans from animals? Well, it's self-awareness, right? The ability to think of yourself as a entity, that kind of level of sentience. I mean, animals have it to a certain extent, but that's what sets off across humanity, that ability to really reflect upon your experiences. This is what makes us human. And really, when I say story here, I'm talking about the very basic hero's journey. That's why I never understand how, especially academics and whatnot, they will try to pretend the hero's journey. Oh, that's patriarchal. Oh, that's postcolonial. Whatever. Try to pretend that that's like of yesteryear, and we need to develop beyond the hero's journey. Let's get to more collective stories and not stories that focus so much on the individual. Well, you can't do that because that's how a human being survives, by thinking of ourselves as the heroes of our own story. We have to think of ourselves as the heroes of our own story. That's very basic learning. I mean, that's how, primitive man has a run-in with the dancing red tongue and realizes, oh, that's fire. It's going to hurt me. Remember last time I had a challenge, I encountered the fire, it hurt me. Don't do that again. I mean, that's basic human experience, learning, thinking of yourselves as the hero of your own story and reflecting on the stories of your past and your experiences. So it's basic humanity. And we have to do that every day. Of course, now in modern times, whenever we go through any kind of challenge, any kind of trauma, or just new experience in general. I mean, just getting up in the morning and getting out of bed is a journey into the unknown, because you don't know what the future of that day is going to bring. So and then at the end of those days, or even at the end of the experience within the day, we have to think back on it. We have to reflect on it. It's how we integrate it into ourselves. It's how we learn. It's how we grow and become better, and so forth. And people who are able to reflect on their experiences more than others, tend to be people who grow a bit more as human beings. So it's integral there, and it's also, as I say in my intro, we are a product of the stories we tell ourselves psychologically. And by that, I don't mean stories are as in just fictitious stories. I mean, the more real our perception of things, and the more in touch with the reality and the objective truth of things, the better, off we'll be to a certain extent. But everybody has certain perceptions. One of the examples I give in my classes, for example, is I say, let's say I was, coming into a classroom and I'm giving this live lecture, and the person sitting in the front row just looks incredibly bored, and they even perhaps look a little pissed off, and they're not laughing at any of my jokes that I make during the lesson or whatever. They're not even remotely taking notes. They're just whatever. Now I see their reaction, and I might think, wow, I'm not that great of a teacher. I mean, look, I can't even get the person in the front row to at least, acknowledge the presence of their teacher. Man, I'm just not that great of a teacher. But let's say that the reality of the situation is actually that they just found out that their dog died at home or whatever. So they are just totally in a different place. They're emotionally traumatized or whatever. That's the reason for their behaviors. It really doesn't matter, though, to me. If the story I've told myself about that experience is that they're reacting because I'm not a good teacher, then I'll internalize that, and I'll start to feel the consequence of not being a good teacher, and I'll feel guilty, and then I'll try to, it'll affect me, and I'll try to, not really. I'm just giving a hypothetical situation. I wouldn't really react that harshly to one student. I mean, heck, hardly any students pay attention these days, but you know what I'm saying. It's just an example. So even if the story isn't necessarily true, if you tell yourself the story and believe it's true, it might as well be true to a certain extent in terms of the effects it's going to have on you. So we are a product of the stories we tell ourselves in that respect, just about our day, our daily experience. And then, of course, you get into higher structures and higher uh, contexts of life, whatever religious systems you believe in, there are stories involved, right? I mean, you believe them to be true, but they're still stories, and you're a product of those stories, believing that they're true. Politics, whatever side you take on politics, that's a product of the stories you believe to be true about those issues, and so forth. So you can't get away from story. Story is the very basic building block of who you are as a human being. And as I say, when I say story, I mean the hero's journey, the basic hero's journey. Now, if that's the case, if story is such a foundational part of our human existence, I mean, the very foundation, of our metaphysical being, for the sake of anything. I mean, it's, in some respect, you can say that even the human reflection upon God is God as story. Now, don't take me too far with this, because I'm not trying to lay it down some theology or whatever. Um, but in general, any religion, a lot of religion, you can't think of God as a creator without God being the beginning and the end. I mean, the Bible, Christ is on the Alpha and the Omega, the Greek terms for beginning and end of the alphabet. Yeah, there, so there's always just sort of this linear, there's this narrative. Like, you can't even really conceive of a God without a story of some kind. So yeah, maybe that's as far as we'll go with that kind of thing. Now, if that is the case, if stories are so important to us, and if even if we don't realize it, we are the product of stories, be they true, false, or some variation in between, then the type of stories that we spend time with is going to affect us too. The type of stories that we recognize are just stories. So, like our fictions, the type of movies, books, television shows, comics, or whatever, the types of stories we tend to spend time with in terms just for entertainment purposes or recreation purposes. And I mean that. So, not stories that we're consciously trying to drive to look at as religion or anything like that. Just, like at the end of the day, when you just want to sit on the front of the TV and just veg, and just check out or whatever. We tend to have the idea, well, those kind of stories won't affect us because now I'm just vegging or I'm just looking at something for entertainment. So that's not going to affect me. How could you be so naive to think that wouldn't affect you? Even if consciously you realize that this is now a fiction story, this is for entertainment purposes, you're still so built on story that the stories you spend time with are going to affect you. And that's just a basic truth. If you watch a lot of types of nihilistic stories, well, you're not going to eventually have a great outlook on life. I mean, that's just kind of how the human mind works. Likewise, if you watch nothing but a bunch of fluff, if you watch nothing but a bunch of there's nothing wrong with fluff. Okay, I love some just good old fluff, entertainment watching every now and then. But if that's all you ever watch, it's like a diet. Your brain and mind and soul isn't going to really be able to get the nutritional story value, any depth or anything like that. And even if you do, it's kind of a crude example. Okay, I'm going to give it anyway because it's kind of crude, but it's good. I think it's analogous, because I always think that good story is kind of like a diet. We understand that when it comes to food, we need to eat vitamins, we need to eat vegetables and so forth, and whatever your belief is about food, you need basic good nutrients. And people think that's not true about story somehow. Well, no, when it comes to story, I can just live on Twinkies and nothing but Twinkies, and I'll be fine. Well, no, if story affects you, then you do have to pay attention to getting a certain depth of story as well. But even if you're watching good stories are really in depth, and by good, I don't mean necessarily, and the good guy always wins. I'm talking about the good written story, a depth of story. How whatever kind of genre story it is. Even if you're watching some good stories and really partaking of that, if you're not really letting it do its work in you, or if you're not actually thinking about it or not watching it on any active level, it's kind of like what nutritionists talk about, how like you need probiotics in your system. Otherwise, if you take vitamins, you're just going to, excrete them right out. They're not actually going to get absorbed by your body. They're just going to, end up in your waste or whatever. That's like it's a health thing or whatever. Your body needs to have certain help in order to absorb the vitamins and the vegetables and so forth that you eat. That's kind of what it's like when you do watch good story, but you're not actually trying to engage with it. You're just like letting it pass over you totally passively. You might as well not eat. You might as well not. You might as well just be watching fluff. So stories affect us. The fictional stories are going to affect us too. Now we have to know where stories come from. Everything I just said, they're from the basic, metaphysical existence, the experiential fact of humanity, is story. And you need to understand that. And you need to understand it on the one hand for just basic story appreciation, health and whatnot, but especially if you're a writer, the more you understand that, the better. It's kind of like, I mean, you can still write stories without thinking about that or understanding it, but it's kind of like anything else. Like if you're a musician, I started playing bass back in the day in high school, just learning other bass lines I would listen to on stereo, just learning bass lines from ZZ Top or from Aerosmith or whatever, listening to them, kind of memorizing them and playing them. And that's great. I was playing a bass line and it was fun to play a bass line. And so you might say on some level I was a bass player because I was playing a bass line. Even when I started, jamming with other musicians or whatever at first, just as I'm learning, but I didn't really understand what I was doing. It's one thing to learn the notes in an order and then repeat them as with any instrument, but it's another thing to start learning, okay, this song has a key and there's a reason that I can play a C when the key is A minor instead of a C sharp. There's a reason I can, noodle around here or whatever. And when you start to understand just even a little bit of music theory and the real where, how the song was built, how the right notes come forth and the wrong notes sound bad, you start to understand how it works. Well, then you're a much better musician, no matter what instrument you play, because then you can start to do some variations. You can write your own bass line suddenly, or musical, compositions, whatever. That's the same way with anything. Writing is the same way. We're such we're as human beings, we're so ingrained in story that it's somewhat easy for anybody just to kind of tell a story. And maybe you're even kind of just blessed with sort of a natural knack for it. People like to listen to you or like to hear your ideas about stories or whatever. So maybe you even have a natural knack for it. That'll take you a little farther as a writer than somebody who doesn't have that. But really understanding where story comes from and what it's going to do in the listeners, it's going to do some work in your listeners. And once you really start to understand that, and then you start to think about the types of stories you want to tell, you can even be more purposeful about the types of effects you want to bring out with your story. It's the same thing, like I say, with archetypes all the time. Anybody can write a story about a frontiersman, but if you really understand the work that a frontiersman archetype does in our psyche and in our society, then you can make better decisions about your story. Then you can avoid pitfalls, things you might have your character to do that just don't resonate well or don't seem right with an audience because you've betrayed an archetype. You've started out with this archetype and then you've done something that that character might shouldn't do or whatever, or doesn't typically do in our stories and whatnot. So it helps knowing where these kind of things come from. Help.